Hi, I'm Grace Binnie, and I'm going to talk about my family. My maiden name was Mooney, and I've called it the comings and goings of the Mooneys. While looking through family photographs, I noticed some of an old gravestone with a cross and anchor, and what intrigued me, words engraved at the base that looked like some sort of a poem. I spoke to the staff at the Greenock Cemetery, who, when I called them, immediately said, "There are 20 people in that grave, there is no room for anyone else." I assured them I was only interested in who was in the grave, so they gave me a map to find it and a list of my family buried there, the Mooney family. The grave was purchased by my great-great-grandfather Daniel in 1873 for £1 10s, and I was right about the poem. It reads, "Short was the warning that came from the Lord above, that took me from my wife and the children that I love. Forbear to weep, 'tis vain to mourn. From dust I came, and now to dust return." From the grave I then decided I would try to trace the people on the list. I did this from the parish records of St Mary's, the Watt Library and the Registrar's Office. I collected a lot of information. In the 1830s, a Dennis Mooney, his wife Mary and their son Daniel arrived in Greenock from Ireland. I am still searching for the county. It seems that the name Mooney is all over Ireland on pubs. I guess that's a hands-on search for the future. Dennis was a blacksmith, and they lived in William Street, where their daughter Susan was born in 1839 and Henry in 1841. I have little information about Susan, but Henry married in Glasgow. In 1850, Daniel, the first son, met and married Elizabeth Dick from Paisley. They married in St Mary's, Greenock. They had 4 children, but 3 of them died before their 3rd birthday and are buried in our grave. When Daniel left the Navy in 1854, he joined Elizabeth, who was a fritterer and poulterer, in her shop. They appear in the post office directories of 1859 as grocers at 8 Man's Lane, then in 7 East Quay Lane, and then in 1879 their shop was at 5 William Street. When Daniel died in 1884, Elizabeth decided to leave Greenock. It was she who had put up the gravestone with its inscription, but she then moved to Ellon and bought a shop. The shop was a success. My grandfather used to tell of visiting her and helping her in the shop. Elizabeth died in 1897, and the story goes most of her son Daniel's inheritance went to her lawyer. Daniel could neither read nor write. I think perhaps I should look for his descendants, the lawyers I mean. In 1874 in St Launce's, Daniel married Mary Rogers from Belfast. They were both 21. They lived in Stanners Lane, where 2 of their children, Daniel and Mary, were born. This Daniel joined the Merchant Navy in 1884. I recently found his ticket of register number 35687 and that the port of Greenock was number 97. From these I hope to find the names of his ships and destinations. On Daniel's first voyage to Australia, he and some others were forced or shanghaied from his ship to work on a sheep farm. It was 2 years before he could pay his passage home. Amazingly, a few years later, the owner of the farm came to Greenock to apologise and recompense Mary and the children for all the grief and hardship he had caused. Daniel and Mary then moved to 16 William Street, where on the 25th of December 1881, my grandfather Peter was born. They had 1 more child, Sarah. She was a character and full of fun. Peter married Gracie McNeill from Barra in St Mary's, Greenock in July 1903. He was a foundry labourer and Gracie was a flax mill worker. They lived in West Stewart Street and had 6 children, Daniel, Peter, Thomas, Helen, James and Mary. In 1912, Daniel, aged 9, died in the Gateside Hospital. Peter was sent to the Watt College and trained as a radio operator. His first voyage was so bad that he and a few others jumped ship and stayed. It was Australia. He never came home again. Peter married Edna Martins. She and her family were German and had changed their names and emigrated to Australia after World War I. They married in Australia and they had a daughter, Joan, and a son, Maxwell. It wasn't until 1992, after her father had died, that Joan traced, found and came over to meet with our family. At the start of World War II, Thomas Tommy was married to Nancy McIver and they had a daughter, Grace, who died at 18 months, and two sons, Peter and James. Tommy was called up and sent to Burma. It was to be 6 years before he saw Nancy and the boys again. But they saw him. Along with many others, Nancy, Peter and Jim went to a Glasgow cinema where they watched a movie-tone newsreel. As all the men marched forward through the mud, it was monsoon time in Burma. Each would stop at the camera and speak to his family. When Tommy came forward, Peter and Jim were about 9 and 7, but they still remember their dad telling them he loved them, missed them, and to be good for their mother. There was a party in the welfare building when finally Tommy came home. Of the 6 children, Daniel had died and Tommy had married and Peter had gone to Australia. The youngest, Mary, never married but stayed with her sister Helen and her husband, Hugh Maloney. They had 2 daughters, Elizabeth and May. May died in 1944, only 10 months. In October 1939, Jimmy married Bridget MacDonald in St Launces. They lived in West Stewart Street, where Jimmy was born. They had 3 daughters, Joan, Helen and Grace. Jimmy was a sapper in the Royal Engineers, but his stories about the war were how Bridget would ask him on his next leave to bring home nylons, but he was in North Africa. Also, because he had a rare blood type, if you rubbed the khaki uniforms hard against his skin, it would come up in great welts, and he and his friends put this to good use. They would create the welts and take him for medical treatment to the US doctors. He would be admitted and they would visit at meal times. It had to be the American base because their food was so much better than the British. They also had a party for Jimmy when he came home, but it was in the wash house. I have not yet found out the history of all the people buried in our grave, but I am now beginning to put together the lives and stories of our family since we arrived in Greenock about 180 years ago.